What's up, heathens? How ya doing? I'm the Godless engineer, and I critically analyze apologist claims to give you the best arguments and information so that you can stand up and use your voice. Today, we're going to be looking at a channel called Wretched. It's a popular apologist channel that seeks to inform its viewers on how to argue against atheists and their counter arguments to their bullshit. Today, he's going to be giving us 4 apologetic arguments against the idea that atheists just don't know God exists. Let's see what he has for us today.
Is number 3 from Psalm 19. In creating the universe, God has made his presence inexcusably obvious.
Oh, great. So it's going to be more of, for the Bible tells me so. I'm really tired of these biblical arguments. They really just all boil down to presuppositional statements that they claim are inherently true just because their book says it is. Well, heathens, if you want to find out why Todd Friel from Wretched is wrong, then please stay tuned. Before we get into today's video, I do want to start off by saying that if a God does exist, because I don't know whether or not a God exists, could he exist? Sure. I don't see anything that says that he can't. But if a God were to exist, I would want that God to at least appreciate the thoughtful consideration that I've given whether or not to believe in him. Any reasonable and I would say righteous God would take that into consideration, that I just simply wasn't convinced and that's not something that I can control. If God does exist and those are attributes that he lacks, then I really wouldn't want to serve or be in the presence of that God. So whatever kind of torture or other place he set up for me, I'm perfectly fine with my choices and that they have sent me there. But ultimately, I don't know if a God exists or even if he has those attributes. I just simply remain unconvinced. And like I said before, I don't control what convinces me. That is completely out of my hands. If God exists and if God has created me, then he has created me to be unconvinced by the poor arguments that his apologists regularly parade everywhere. All right, with that out of the way, let's see what Todd has for us. Take it away, Todd.
There you are, standing before God with no loved ones, no lawyer, and no excuses. The all-knowing judge of the world not only heard the evidence of your crimes, he's an eyewitness to your law-breaking. You and I are guilty beyond the shadow of a doubt. The King of Kings is about to bring down the mallet of his justice and pass sentence. If you are guilty, you'll be sent to an eternity in God's prison, a very real place called hell. Your fate is about to be decided, and there are no appeals. As God prepares to render your eternal verdict, you feel a desperate need to plead your case.
Whew. That is a lot of fucking drama to start out this video with. I mean, I get it. You're setting it up as though we're on Judgment Day and I'm being judged by God. I do like how you have in your intro here that it's God's prison. God created hell so that he could send people there that don't believe in him or his son's sacrifice. Since people can't control what convinces them, it seems like God has created a certain number of people so that he can torture them in hell forever. Now, this is the start of the presuppositionalist argument. He's starting off the video just stating that this is in fact going to happen in the future. The only way that he knows this is because his Bible tells him about it. This is not a convincing argument, and it shouldn't be a convincing argument to anybody that is critically considering this argument. He says that I am guilty of breaking the law or guilty in some kind of fashion that's definitely going to send me to hell. But more importantly, we're all guilty of this. There's no escape from it. So it doesn't matter what good or bad that I've done in my life. When I get to heaven on his presuppositionalist claim here, it's not going to matter what I've done because I'm damned just like he's damned and everybody else is damned. The only difference here is whether or not you believe in the sacrifice of Jesus. Sacrifice. Of course, he's not going to cover here the wide range of arguments that could come up in whatever kind of case that I could plead. He's only going to cover one particular aspect of it.
And that typically is when the person cries, objection. Let's tackle them and learn how to respond to the inevitable objections that unbelievers will offer. Here we go.
Typically, presuppositionalists will start out a discussion or a debate by trying to put you on the defensive. In this particular instance, he's trying to put me on the defensive about how I would plead my case. Of course, my position is I don't need to plead my case. It makes no sense, but this is part of the presuppositionalist tactic. Put you on the defense so that you have to defend yourself against their made-up scenario that most likely isn't going to happen.
Objection, Your Honor. I didn't know that you existed. Before I share with you the response and don't stub your toe, what would you say to that objection? Can you think of one Bible verse that would counter what seems to be reasonable? I just didn't know that God existed. He never wrote his name in the clouds. No miracles were performed for me. I didn't know he existed. What would you say? Can you think of one response? Can you think of two? Can you think of three? Could I encourage you to actually memorize 4 responses?
Oh, wow. 4 responses to this? Oh, damn. You guys have a lot of bullshit to back up your magical, made-up story. Now, of course, the Bible is littered with responses to this whole I didn't know God existed. They could pull out any number of arguments here to stuff into the 4 arguments he's going to present. Let's fast forward through his little diatribe here and let's get to the actual arguments that he's presenting instead of all this theatrical shit.
May I encourage you to memorize these 4 responses to their objection? Here's the first from Ecclesiastes 3:11. Every human intuitively knows that there is an afterlife. God has put it into them when he knit them together in their mother's womb. Something inside that says, when I die, there's something beyond the veil, and that is why people fear death.
I don't think that's the reason why people fear death. We fear death because it's an instinctual response. I mean, we're hardwired at a very basic level to survive and to live. So if something's going to potentially cause us to die and our brain interprets it that way, then we're going to want to do something that will preserve our life. It's just a very basic instinct. And we know that this isn't like because God stitched us together in our mother's womb, whatever in the fuck that means. Does God crochet or some shit? But it's painfully obvious that this is just a basic instinct of living organisms. We see this reaction of wanting to preserve our life in multiple organisms across the planet, which I guess the presuppositionalist ad hoc argument that you could bring up for this is that yes, God does crochet every single organism into existence in their mother's wombs. But that's just an ad hoc argument that you tack on to it because we've exposed a hole in your logic. And as far as humans intuitively knowing that there's some kind of life after death, I think this is part of that baser instinct to survive. We just simply couldn't comprehend what was after death. And so what was the survival instinct that kicked in? Well, make shit up. And that's what we did. I mean, the human mind is capable of making up a lot of crazy shit. One of those particular pieces is some kind of afterlife that exists after this. And there have been multiple different versions of the afterlife that have existed prior to Christianity. So my question to you would be, what makes you think that your particular version of the afterlife is the real version of the afterlife? I guess you would say something like, Jesus resurrected, therefore the Bible's version of the afterlife is the real one because he resurrected. I just find that to be a very circular argument, and it's still not convincing. So does every human intuitively know that there's an afterlife? No. I really don't think. I think that's something that you've got to be told, or it's something that you just make up in order to have an answer.
And you can use that to reason with somebody. Make it an organic conversation, not just a lecture, not just a sermon that isn't a two-way street. Reason with them. My friend, don't you have a sense that there's something that happens to us after we die? Isn't that why we all kind of get the heebie-jeebies thinking about, oh, what's that going to be like? Because we know that there is something there. You know that there is an afterlife. Why? Because God put that into you, and that's why it's unreasonable for you to say, well, I didn't know.
Okay, so let's just assume that that is somehow intimately crocheted into our DNA. How do you distinguish that your God is the one that had the needle and thread and crocheted that shit into us? All you have is your presuppositionalist argument that your book claims that your God is the one that did it. Again, circular argument that relies on presupposing that your God exists. That's not how reason works, by the way. If you're going to come at me with a circular argument, don't call it reasoning with me, because that's not what you're doing. You're providing me apologetics that have been fed to you by people like Todd. And we get the heebie-jeebies from anything that we just simply don't know or don't understand. I mean, when you're a kid, you're afraid of the monster under the bed. That doesn't mean that there's actually a monster there. Or for KC, it's the booger dog. It's okay for us not to know what happens after we die, and it's okay for us to get goosebumps or get scared about death. That is a survival instinct. Without the instinct to survive and propagate the species, we wouldn't be here today. So yes, that's intricately woven in our subconscious, in our baser instincts, but not by God. It's explained by evolution.
Objection number 2. Response. This from the book of Romans. God has hardwired humans to innately know that he exists. This is different than the hardwiring of eternity in their hearts. He, in Romans 1, makes it clear over and over and over again. Every single person knows God exists. They don't know him in a right relationship, but they know God exists.
So this is the whole argument of, well, atheists know God exists. They just reject him and they don't want to know him because then they're held accountable to his moral laws or something like that. This has only confused me more once I started looking at the moral argument in depth and how that compares to Christian theology. Like I stated at the very beginning of this response, when you get to this judgment that supposedly happens, the only difference between Todd and I is that he believes in Jesus' sacrifice and I simply don't. So if you're going to come at me with this whole idea that I reject God, I choose not to know God because I want to sin and I just don't want to follow God's moral rules, I really don't know what you're talking about. Because even in Christianity, the moral rules really don't matter. It doesn't matter if I'm a good person or a bad person. As long as I believe in Jesus, I get through the pearly gates. But more to the point here, God has not hardwired people to know that he exists. God is a concept that we made up because we simply didn't know what processes controlled our planet and our reality in general. This is so plainly obvious when you take a look at scientific discoveries throughout time. As we progress in our knowledge of this reality, of this universe, of this planet, the gap for God to exist in, that gap in our knowledge, gets smaller and smaller and smaller. Right now, the gap that God lives in is so small that it could be on the quantum level, or maybe even a little bigger than that and on a chemical level. That's where God exists now. So we're not hardwired to know that he exists. We made that shit up as a way to explain the things that we didn't know about this reality.
Are you saying, skinny guy, that they know some sort of nebulous concept of God? No, I'm saying that Romans 1 says they know the true God, and all of their efforts to build an idol are not because they're groping, trying to figure out what this God they know is like. No, they're building that idol to suppress the truth that they do know that he exists. That should be hammer thump number 2.
So right off the bat, Todd starts out with his circular logic that is inherent to presuppositional apologetics. First of all, he's presupposing that the God of the Bible is the one that exists. And then he's using the Bible to prove that, yes, we all do know that God exists, that that specific version of God exists. And because the Bible says it, that confirms that everybody knows it. This is a circular argument, and it should not be convincing to anybody. Also, he claims that unbelievers build these idols so that we can suppress a belief in God. I'm not suppressing a belief in God. I don't choose what convinces me of a particular position. So I can't choose to be convinced that God does exist. What he's doing is a very disingenuous tactic of pushing motive on somebody that has not suggested that they have that motive. This is a red flag of a bad faith conversationalist. He's not here to listen to what you have to say or your reasons for not believing in his magical deity. He's only here to tell you that you know that his God exists, specifically his God exists. Basically, Todd is saying that you have no excuse for not believing in God, which totally ignores the reality of how we become convinced of positions.
This is number 3 from Psalm 19. In creating the universe, God has made his presence inexcusably obvious. If there's a TV monitor, there is a TV monitor maker. Day after day, this TV is actually broadcasting even when it's not on. It is shouting, "Somebody made me. I'm intricately designed. This couldn't have happened by accident." That's exactly the sermon that creation is preaching. Therefore, if you claim, "I didn't know that God exists," it's simply because you have made yourself, forced yourself to be mute and not listen to the sermon that God has been preaching.
This is what's known as the teleological argument, or the argument from design. Basically, the universe looks designed, therefore it is designed. But this is a fallacious argument. For one thing, Todd is very obviously tying this argument from design to his specific definition of God. Even if this universe is designed by some kind of deity, we still have a lot more steps to go through in order to connect this reality to his specific definition of God. But you see, Todd can automatically assume that this God that we're talking about is his particular version of God, because that's how presuppositionalism works. One big problem with the argument from design is that he's confusing things that are obviously designed by man, because we have prior knowledge that they were designed by man, and natural processes in the natural world. We don't have any concrete evidence that a God is needed in order for natural processes to happen. So you would first need to prove that God is necessary for natural processes to happen in the natural world. But as far as we can tell, no supernatural intervention is needed for natural processes to happen. A very simple example of this is the rain cycle. We don't need God in order to make it rain. At one point in time in our past, we thought we needed to sacrifice different animals and people in order to please the gods so that they would make it rain and make the crops bountiful. But we know what the rain cycle is now, and we also know that God is not the one that controls the rain cycle. It's a natural process that is controlled by the laws of physics. Until you can prove that a supernatural deity is needed for natural processes like the water cycle, then you don't have any evidence whatsoever to suggest that your God is the one that's making all of these natural processes happen. It boils down to an equivocation fallacy. He actually started off this particular point by making an equivocation fallacy, because the broadcasting of a television screen, or even the electromagnetic waves that the TV could possibly receive in order to display the images, is a different form of broadcasting than what he's talking about. When he says broadcasting, he's just talking about it existing. But this is a really good example of the equivocation fallacy, because he is comparing these man-made objects for which we know were designed and created by man, and comparing them to something that is not comparable. Natural processes and just the natural world in general.
Hammer thump. What's it called when you bang? Hammer bang number. I don't want to get all home and gardeny on you.
Oh, well, shit, I didn't realize it was all home and gardeny to talk about how a hammer hits things.
Number 4, This from Romans 2, God has given us a conscience to know we have sinned against our Maker. Every time we do something wrong, we know. Even the cartoons get that. They've got the bad angel telling you do the bad thing, and then they've got the good angel. What is that?
Well, those would be visual depictions of our conscience, a visual representation of the moral decisions that we make every day. But I would also contend that not everybody has this attribute. I've said this before many times, but psychopaths and sociopaths are prime examples of people that just don't have a conscience like we all understand. But I also have to ask, exactly which moral code are we supposed to compare our actions to? Because as you look at Christianity throughout time, you have God with these different sets of moral laws that he lays down. I mean, if you look in the Old Testament, you have God commanding the Israelites to go and destroy an entire people, kill everybody there, especially the little boys and all the older boys and all the older girls that have been fucked before, but save for themselves the little girls so that they can take them as spoils of war. So God was commanding that. How can we also not do that now? How is that not considered a good thing now? When a mother gets a vision or a message from God to cut off all the limbs of her children, how is that not a good thing now? I mean, obviously you would probably think that, oh, well, she's just crazy. She's not really getting messages from God because God wouldn't tell her to do that. What about fucking Abraham and Isaac? That was God telling him to go and kill the kid and then burn his body. Don't tell me God is above, mutilating children. From my own experience, I didn't mention God to my son. I may have brought it up once and asked him, hey, buddy, you want to know what God is? And he's like, nope. And then he kept on playing. And so he didn't really care. So no, not everybody has this moral foundation where we're comparing our actions to what God wants us to do, which is what you're getting at here. Again, this boils down to a presuppositionalist argument. He presupposes that his God exists. He also presupposes that his God has a moral code that he expects all of us to live up to. But when we're being judged, it doesn't matter whether or not we followed that moral law. If you remember from the beginning of the video, he talks about how we're all guilty. We're all damned to hell. And it's only believing in Jesus that saves us. So I really don't understand this point in your 4 points that's supposed to be a good set of arguments against atheists. Because you've even admitted here in this video that it doesn't matter whether or not we sin against God or anything like that. Because we've already sinned against God. We're already these dirty, despicable things that needs blood to wash us away, like the blood of Jesus or something. I'm really confused on this moral argument. If you're a theist that's made it this far into the video, I would really love for you to explain that particular aspect of Christianity to me, because it just seems contradictory.
It's crude, it's not precise, but it is an understanding that they all recognize we all have a conscience. Therefore, bang, 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 bang.
God, his incessant banging. So how I account for this conscience that we have, or this idea that we've done something wrong, is the fact that we are held accountable to something higher than ourselves, our society. Our society imposes these certain moral laws and rules on us. We learn these rules from our parents, and not all parents have the same moral rules or laws as other parents. That ends up creating this diverse set of moral foundations that do exist in any one society. But just because we all have a shared moral foundation within a singular society does not mean that God is the one that laid those moral foundations down. Moral foundations change throughout culture, throughout time, and throughout place. What could be seen as morally okay or neutral here, or morally good even, could be seen as morally deplorable in another area. The only way that this makes sense is not that God is the one that's dictating our moral foundation. The only way that this makes sense is if our moral foundation is just an emergent property of complex central nervous systems. When an organism gets to a level of complexity that it can ponder its existence or sort of think for itself and consider its actions against other living organisms, at that point we start developing these basic moral foundations. And we see this in organisms all across the globe. Well, that's going to be it for Todd today. He still thinks that I have no reason whatsoever to deny God. But I'm not so much denying God as I just remain unconvinced that his particular God exists. Considering his rule book, I really don't think that his God exists. But as far as the God concept in general, he could exist, but ultimately I don't think that we can know. And that's me being unable to be convinced by bad arguments. Because I don't control that shit. Thank you, heathens, for tuning in today. If you will, please go down below. Let me know what you thought about this video. I would really love to hear your opinions on Todd's positions here, his arguments against the idea that atheists just don't know that God exists. I would love to hear your thoughts. While you're down there, make sure you smash that like button and subscribe if you like this kind of content. Don't forget to stand up and use your voice. Bye, heathens.